should I say, this should have been a better morning than it should have been. As we speak, there are over 200 people still stuck in the Azovstal steel plant, tens of thousands of people still hanging off a hinge while others die agonizing deaths in Mariupol and other places. And what used to be the city of Mariupol seems very pulverized and is indeed pulverized. And yet here we are today to talk about more, not less terror. And to do that, I have a powerful panel of colleagues drawn from different parts of the world to signify the universal nature of this and indeed other crises around the world. I will be introducing them momentarily, but I would like to spend a moment to just speak about the housekeeping rules. When speaking, please can we speak through the microphone so that the translators can translate through. This conference is going to last about an hour, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions to the panel or to arrange different interviews with the different panel members. The Amnesty International delegation has been in Ukraine for this past week, visiting different areas as well as meeting various people, including victims and survivors, NGOs and government officials. I will now introduce the panel, which is led by our Secretary General, Dr. Agnes Kalama, who decided the magnitude of this conflict could not be ignored and wanted a delegation drawn from all over the world, from the global north and from the global south, to join her in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Very important. She will tell us more about why we're here and what observations have been made. I will now introduce the panel. In the middle over there, in glasses, is our Secretary General, Agnes Kalama. Next to her is Donatella Rovero, who is our senior advisor, crisis advisor. And Donatella, sorry, there seems to be a problem with the translation of it being too loud. Is it possible for the translators to speak a little less loud? Do you need a mic to speak, or is it, or do you do? Yes, of course. Can you speak a little less loud, please? Right. Yes. Yeah. Is there anything we can do to work on the acoustics? Should we perhaps turn down the speaker so everyone can wear the headphones? Is that a possibility? Okay. Okay. Shall we continue? Yeah? Okay. All right. Thank you. So I was saying that I just introduced Dr. Kalamar, who invited this entire delegation to be here to show our solidarity to the people of Ukraine. And next to her is our senior crisis advisor, who's been on the ground for 4 weeks documenting war crimes committed by Russian forces, contained in a briefing we are releasing today, and the briefing is entitled "He's Not Coming Back: War Crimes in Northwest Areas of Kyiv Oblast." Then next to Donatella, we have Oksana Polkacho. Oksana is the director of Amnesty International here in Ukraine, to reflect on how this has impacted Ukraine and about Amnesty's work to ensure justice for human rights violations committed in this dastardly war. Next to her is Rajat Khosla, who is our Senior Director for Research and Advocacy, and he'll answer questions related to international justice. At the far end is my colleague, Denis Krivoshiev, who's the Deputy Director for the Eastern European and Central Asia Regional Office of Amnesty International, which also covers Ukraine, and he'll also help answer some of the questions related to this region. And last but not the least is my colleague next to me. His name is Mazen Darwish. Mazen is a Syrian lawyer and director of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression. Mazen has witnessed firsthand the horrors of war and suffered at the hands of Russian-supported human rights violations in Syria. He now works in documentation and litigation of war crimes on Syria. He will be here to answer questions, but he will also present the importance of connectivity among communities around the world. And lastly, my name is Muleya Mwananyanda. I'm the Deputy Regional Director for our Southern Africa Regional Office in Amnesty International. I'm based in Johannesburg. I have left my 5-year-old twins and traveled over 8,500 kilometers to be in Ukraine, and I'll be happy to answer questions on why Africa should not be indifferent and must denounce violations resulting from the war in Ukraine. I will now hand over to Agnes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muleya, and welcome to our press conference. Over the past week, I've had the honor of leading an international delegation to Ukraine, composed of Amnesty International experts and partners from India, Syria, Zambia, France, Belarus, and of course, Ukraine. The international nature of the delegation is a crucial message that we want to deliver today to the Ukrainian people and to the international community. Before arriving in Ukraine, we met with refugees who had fled to Poland. And while in Ukraine, we met with those who had lost family members and homes to Russian bombs and guns. We met with human rights defenders, and we met with a vast number of senior government officials. And today, we are here to present Amnesty International's most recent findings on war crimes committed by Russia. And we are also here to highlight the universal implication of this aggression and to demonstrate global solidarity with the people of Ukraine. It's a war on the world's richest continent against a sovereign nation by one of the world's most powerful countries and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, prompted allegedly by dispute over multilateral mechanisms. It's an aggression, not the slings and arrows of heated diplomatic exchange, not an exercise of rhetoric politics, nor a deployment of a legitimate policy option. In a rare, even historic move, Amnesty International denounced Russia's unlawful use of force as a violation of the United Nations Charter and an act of aggression, a crime under international law. This is a move we very rarely make. As an international crime, aggression demands international accountability. Russia's aggression was the trigger of an international armed conflict, characterized now by escalating violations with catastrophic consequences for the people of Ukraine, such as in Borodyanka, where at least 40 civilians were killed in disproportionate and indiscriminate attack, or in Bucha, where Amnesty International documented 22 cases of unlawful killings. Let me be clear. Extrajudicial execution committed in an international armed conflict constitute war crimes. Indiscriminate and disproportionate airstrikes carried out with criminal intent are also war crimes. The evidence we have gathered since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began in late February 2022. It implicates Russian military forces in serious violations of international law, including extrajudicial killings, disproportionate, indiscriminate attacks against civilians, including in densely populated areas, deployment of cluster munition that, being so indiscriminate, are banned under international law, abuses against civilians living under siege, and failure to protect and secure humanitarian corridors. In other words, we know that the crimes committed against people living around Kiev, which we are reporting on today, are not merely anecdotal, incidental, or collateral. We know they are part of a pattern that has characterized Russia's conduct of the hostilities from the outset, a repeated pattern, large in scale and devastating in impact. Lest there be any doubt, this is not yet the performance of another geopolitical clash. It is death, massive, and it is destruction. None of this is understandable. None of it has logic worthy of the name. All of it, the aggression, the bombardment, the wanton killing, the ruined villages and cities, all of it is a choice that did not have to be made, whose consequences we have yet to fully appreciate, and from which most of us now cannot hope to hide, the fuller force of which is borne by the people of Ukraine. Yet, in spite of that evidence, around the world, there are many, far too many, who would believe that the aggression was somehow warranted, that the harmful action taken is somehow justifiable. It is true that Russia's aggression was met with seemingly swift international retribution. A range of sanctions have been imposed by countries around the world. But dig a bit deeper, and you find something else. No nation has turned its eyes away, yet the gaze of many is vacant, empty of solidarity, of principles, and of rules. Some claim neutrality, non-alignment, on grounds of the West's double standard. Others go so far as to express sympathy with Moscow. But the crimes committed in Ukraine are of flesh and bone, death and injury, utter ruin, and they are utterly unacceptable, no matter your ideology, your fervent nationalism, your resentment of an unfair West, or your hopes for future investment. Ultimately, that is the truth of this crisis, a truth that is told by the people of Ukraine themselves and what they are living through, a truth that must be heard above the political clamor, including that of the Western powers' all too selective solidarity, and that of leaders in the global South, all too short-sighted rhetorical accommodations. After all, the realities of our global village means millions of lives far beyond the borders of Ukraine and Russia have also been and are being harmed. Global food chains are eroded, fuel and energy prices hacked up, opportunities needed for recovery from COVID are lost. And indeed, Russia's aggression challenges us all. What kind of world do we want to live in? One that is built on bullying, authoritarianism, the brutality of weapons deployed above and beyond the weight of the law. Throughout our mission here in Ukraine, the delegation has highlighted that key message. Russia's aggression against Ukraine matters to us all. It has unleashed an international crisis that deserves global solidarity. We will continue to push this message forward wherever leaders seek to disinform or distort, whenever they claim that bullying, aggression, militarization are preferable to the international rule of law. We have also suggested during this mission that Ukraine's officials engage further with governments and countries outside the Western world, the African Union, government and parliaments of Africa, of Asia, of Latin America. They too must be reached out by the leaders of Ukraine, because we need a coalition of support that is much broader than the one currently constructed by the US and its allies. We need to enlist the contribution of many others in combating what is at heart a war about our future and a war about values. Ultimately, how justice is delivered for the people of Ukraine will be key to winning not only the war militarily, but to reconstructing communities, a country and a world where truth rules over lies, where rules preside over force, and where rights are upheld for all people. Our mission over the last week has focused heavily on understanding what steps are underway in terms of criminal investigation and prosecution, the mechanisms in place to secure international support. Our first concern is with the victims of crimes. The Ukrainian people's demands are enormous. They are pressing, they are urgent, they are heartbreaking. And active conflict continues, meaning daily there are more victims, more crimes committed, more crimes to report. We found evidence of the many efforts underway, and we can talk about it further. But we found evidence too of the many gaps and limitations already present. Limited resources and capacities. Policing, forensic systems are stretched to their limit, with peacetime capacities just not sufficient given the scale and the nature of the crimes committed. There are competing priorities to be balanced between the necessity to clear away the bomb site and rubbles, while also protecting and collecting evidence appropriately and to standard. There are competing priorities too between the crimes to be prosecuted, between those that can be swiftly prosecuted and others that are more complex, between crimes where perpetrators have been identified and those whose direct perpetrators are without face or name or identity. We found tension too between the need or the willingness to prosecute the crime of aggression, but also the importance of prosecuting war crimes committed against people. We also found that the people of Ukraine, the survivors, have many questions that are fed by an overall lack of information for the victims, which then feed rumors, distrust, anger. That problem will only grow as the scale of the crimes in need of investigation expand. And officials are aware of it. We have found a great openness to acknowledge those limitations and to find responses to them. So what are we recommending? First, we urge meaningful and effective adherence to the principle that all who directly commit war crimes should be held criminally responsible for them. Under the doctrine of command responsibility, superiors who knew or had reason to know about war crimes but did not attempt to stop them or punish those responsible, those leaders must be held criminally responsible. In practice, that principle may not be met immediately or to the extent demanded. We know international justice is not swift. So we urge the authorities and those supporting them to please manage public expectations and to do that fairly, transparently, truthfully. there is a lot of politicization of justice, and we really need to preserve the Ukrainian people from it. Indeed, victims' rights cannot and should not be ignored or passed over. What do we mean here? We mean that victims have a right to be heard, to be recognized, to be protected, to be informed, to have procedural matters explained to them. They have a right to the truth. They have the right to participate in mechanisms and processes related to the future of the sites where violations took place, including, for instance, the building in Borodianka. Survivors there want their home back. They don't want a shopping mall on that site. The people themselves must be at the heart of any memorialization process, of any rebuilding process, be they real, symbolic, narrative, ceremonial. Their property right must be fully respected. Ultimately, victims must be able to see ahead the journey to when and where they will fully realize their rights to truth, justice, and reparation. In the longer term, it may be necessary to establish a form of hybrid or internationalized mechanism for accountability in Ukraine, given the limited resources both domestically and within the International Criminal Court, given as well problems that we can elaborate upon in terms of jurisdictions over certain crimes, or indeed the way certain crimes have been defined under domestic law. Amnesty International urged the authorities and the international partners not to rush setting up such mechanism or tribunal, but find the time to insist on its international legitimacy, meaning really building a broad support behind it. For that too will be essential to a long-term victory. The essence of what Amnesty International has found is that it should be people themselves, their lived experience as told in all their grief and scars, in their heart-breaking loss and deprivation. It is their truth that determines what the solution to this heinous conflict must address. And it is the terms and conditions of their future that will hold the truer mirror up to global leadership. Just as it is people across the world who, in global solidarity with the victims of this aggression, cry out. Such violence is not policy or geopolitical positioning. Such violence is utterly, utterly unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnes, for that statement. On Monday, we were in Borodianka, and indeed, human tragedy in Ukraine is human tragedy everywhere. I will now invite my colleague, Donatella, to present the findings of the briefing. He's not coming back. War crimes in northwest areas of Kyiv Oblast. Donatella.
Past 4 weeks, I've been spending time in different parts of the country, especially in the area north of Kyiv, in some of the places that perhaps many of you have visited. One of those places is Borodianka, where I think many of you will have seen the very dramatic images of the buildings that were struck. And so I've spent time to try and investigate what happened, how it happened, why were people still in the buildings when they were bombarded. So there were 8 buildings that were struck in 3 separate attacks, each attack consisting of a number of airstrikes. And in 6 of those buildings, people, civilians who lived in those buildings, many of whom had lived in those buildings for decades, since the buildings were built in the 80s, died. More than 40 people died. The pattern was that in the first building that was struck, each time, that is where the greatest number of victims were. Many of the people who died in those buildings were in the basement, in the cellars, the one place that they thought they would be safe. Some also died in their apartments, but the majorities were in the place where they had gone to seek protection. What we've been able to establish, both from the remains of the frag that we found and from the testimonies of the survivors, I did manage to track down the most of the relatives of those who died and those who survived who were in and around the buildings. And they indicate that these were indeed airstrikes. There was some debate as to what kind of, whether it had been a ground-launched or air-delivered munitions that had hit those buildings. Why did people stay? People stayed because either they did not realize that because they were civilians, they were in their home, in their buildings, that Russian forces would bomb their buildings. People were obviously aware that there were clashes happening nearby. The place where the buildings are located is on the main road where Russian forces were coming through from the northeast, heading for the capital. And there were fierce clashes happening further north at the beginning of the town, and then at the main roundabout at the exit of the town. But obviously people believed that nobody would have any reason to target them while they were in the building. Some were scared and told me that the reason why they stayed was because they were afraid that going out on the road would expose themselves to being killed by Russian forces, because that is what was happening. People could not move freely. In all, more than 600 families lost their homes, that is thousands of individuals, because the buildings were bombed with munitions carried such a large payload that the destruction is not just of the targeted building, but the destruction beyond the point of impact is absolutely massive. Questions have been raised as to what might have been the reasons why Russian forces chose to target those specific buildings. The buildings were hit precisely. They did not waste bombs. They hit every single building that they targeted. There were, in some cases, individuals who did fire on the passing convoy from the building or from beside the buildings. At least in one case, a man who died in the building had been sending messages to members of his family, saying there are people on the roof firing from the roof and from beside the building. Taking all of that into account, was there any legitimate reason for the Russian forces to carry out the kind of strikes that they carried out? No. These were utterly disproportionate strikes, and because their impact was so massive beyond the point that was targeted, these were also indiscriminate strikes. As such, these constitute war crimes, and they should be investigated as such. And I would like to very briefly, for those who haven't seen in any great details the site, sort of show you the kind of work that we've been carrying out at Amnesty International, which is part of the process of preserving the evidence as well as preserving the memory. Those buildings will be demolished very soon. And those buildings contain a lot of information and tell important stories. stories of the people who lived there. This was somebody's kitchen. People left in a hurry. There is still a pot on the stove. And the victims, those who died in those buildings. So it's as much a preserving of the memories of those who lived there and their lives, but also preserving the evidence of what's available in those buildings. Survivors told us in this particular place, this man was in one of the buildings that was destroyed. He was fleeing because another building nearby had been bombed, and he didn't manage to get out before the strike. But thankfully, he managed to survive. So that's why it's important to collect the evidence as soon as possible before it is lost. The other part of this report deals with extrajudicial execution, unlawful killings. In Bucha, a place that many of you will have heard and possibly visited, but also many of the towns and villages, virtually every single town and village that I've visited in the area was also the theater of extrajudicial execution. Some of them were of people who were shot dead on the spot. In other cases, people were held in custody by Russian forces for hours or possibly days before they were killed. So these are not isolated incidents. These are very much part of a pattern. Wherever Russian forces were in control of a town or a village, they deliberately and unlawfully killed individuals. In one place, for example, in Bucha, in one courtyard, surrounded by a number of buildings, 5 men were killed at different times. The same situation in a village in Novi Korohod, north of Bucha, where 4 young men were stopped, killed, and then dumped by the side of the road, their body partly pushed into a ditch. We were also in the pursuit of collecting information that can be used, hopefully, to hold the perpetrators to account, if not today, one day in the future. We looked at a lot of material evidence. Among that we found were bullets and casing. That were particularly important because these are types of armor-piercing bullets which are not used by all Russian forces. They are the head stamps on the casings indicates that they are produced by the cartridge plant in Tula, south of Moscow. And we know that these bullets can be fired only by certain rifles, and that those rifles are fielded to specific elite units that we were able to confirm their presence in Bucha. These casings and spent bullets I found in Bucha, but we also found and were able to view some military documents that indicate the presence of these special units in these places where these crimes were committed. So these extrajudicial execution and unlawful killings are also constitute war crimes. And so that is where I'll stop, and I'll be available for more details.
Thank you very much, Donatella. I will now move over to my colleague, Oksana, to speak to us. Thank you.
Я буду говорити українською мовою.
I'll be speaking Ukrainian. First of all, I would like to appreciate my colleagues, Agnes, Donatella. Thank you very much for your interventions. I have to see you in Kiev. However, I would be much happier if the circumstances were different. However, the international solidarity with Ukraine is paramount now for me as a Ukrainian. The past 2 months were very painful, as painful as for many of you. For the past 3 years, I lived in Irpin. So I was eyewitness to what was happening there, and I feel really helpless now in my hometown, and not only there. I am one of the millions of people who were forced to leave their homes because of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. Millions of Ukrainians left Ukraine, and many more became IDPs. As Amnesty International will be working so that people, no matter who they come from, should have their rights protected. Well, since I left Irpin, I didn't have courage to return because the memories are so painful, but I am sure that in the future I will go back to Irpin. I hope I will. Sometimes in war it's fine to identify trustworthy sources of information, and Amnesty International is working towards providing information, truthful information. This time the delegation visited Bucha, Borodyanka, Hostomel and other localities, but not the end of it. We'll soon be having many more facts and evidence collected during our investigations. You can imagine the horror felt by people who escaped Russian occupation. Us, as Amnesty International, we are resolved and determined to help justice prevail. We want the perpetrators to know that they won't go unpunished, and justice for the victims and those who survived should be established. I indeed am deeply grateful to all my colleagues who've come a long way. I know that people around the world may have no access to accurate information or have access to misinformation. I hope that my colleagues, once they are back home, will tell those they communicate with the truth about the situation. Truth is the only chance to build international solidarity. I thank you for helping us shed the light on what is going on in Ukraine, and I hope that justice and fairness will prevail. Thank you.
Mazen has prepared a statement that he would like to share. Mazen?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I have allergy, but there is no COVID. Sure. Thanks for really Amnesty International and Secretary General Agnes Kalamard and my colleague, especially Amnesty Ukraine, Oksana, Maxime, Vladimir, Katrina, all of them, to make this high mission possible. And it's a really great honor for me. From Polish border to Lviv, to Kyiv, Bucha, Borodyanka, and Hostomel, the truth seems very clear. There is no benefit in war but its end. In Borodyanka, I spoke to a woman who had buried the body of her son, a young man. She's still searching for the body of her daughter and the body of her daughter-in-law. In Bucha, I spoke to a woman. The Russian soldiers took her husband out of the house and executed him in the street. His body lay for days in front of the entrance of the house before she could bury him in a small garden. Dozens of these stories, it's same stories that I had practically experienced with Syrian victims. Unfortunately, these crimes are still happening, whether in Ukraine or Syria. While we are talking here now with you, there is a civilian suffering. And for me, after being in direct contact with all of those victims, it seemed amazing how the stories are identical and how the pain in their eyes is one, and how the picture of the children of Idlib in northern Syria who were killed on their way to school resemble the picture of the children of Sumy in Ukraine. They have the same smile. I think international community, if they do more, if they really have effort to hold accountable Russia and Syrian regime for the war crime and the crime against humanity was done in Syria, maybe we can save some of thousands souls here in Ukraine. Maybe this war not happened in Ukraine. So it's very linked. Each time we allow for this crime to happen in any place, this means that we give a green line in other country for other war crime. However, there is still a chance today to save the lives of those whose reign by making justice and the fight against impunity a global priority, a global movement. Victims everywhere and on all sides deserve truth, justice, and reparation. This is one of the reasons we are here today, to pushing for a comprehensive, balanced, and effective justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mazen. And this brings us to the end of the presentations from the panelists here. We will now open up the floor to questions. I will take 3 questions, and then we'll allow the panelists to answer, and then we will take the next 3 set of questions. The gentleman over here, the gentleman over there. Is there a third hand? And the lady at the back.
Thank you. Richard Lloyd Parry of The Times. What do you believe was the motivation for the crimes committed by the Russian occupying forces? I mean, is it at one end a matter of a failure of discipline by individual units, or is it a deliberate strategic policy to terrorize and to cow? And a second question, have you done any work on potential human rights violations by the Ukrainian side? And do you intend to do that?
Thank you. The gentleman.
I'm Bardi Afshin from Volent Media, Iran International TV. It's a question for Ms. Agnes Kalamoy. You said previously that it's vital that up to the chain of command are brought to justice. At the same time, just now you emphasized that international justice cannot be a swift process. So is it a wishful thinking to see the head of a state, which is a permanent member of UN Security Council, brought to justice, who, as we know, himself ordered, for instance, the siege of Azovstal.
Thank you. And the last question, please.
Emma Fernet from Rai TV Italy. A question for Ms. Rovera. You were talking about weapons used on the ground. Do you have maybe evidence of the same weapons used in Syria and in Libya? Because we were talking about special forces, special units. So if the usage of these weapons could be reconducted to, the same weapons used in Syria and Libya by the special Russian units. And a question for Mr. Darwish. If you see on the aggression and the torture that has been used on civilians, if you see any pattern or similarities of what you've seen in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the questions. Donatella may have more to say about motivation, but as I have mentioned in my introductory remarks, what we have found so far are repeated violations of the same kind. The indiscriminate attacks, the extrajudicial killings, the humanitarian corridors. These have been repeated over the last 70 days. So I think we are beyond attributing them to some, how you put it, lack of discipline. I think you can use that excuse within the first 2 weeks, but after 70 days, that cannot be the case. There is clearly either I will not go to suggest that there are orders necessarily. We don't have that evidence, and at least I am not aware of it. But there is certainly no measures being taken to stop, prevent, or punish those that are engaging in those crimes. So that's for my view on the so-called motivations. We're beyond the failure of discipline. I don't know whether we have enough evidence of a deliberate policy, but we certainly have evidence of a policy of non-intervention over those repeated violations. In terms of the chain of command and the wishful thinking. Yes, international justice takes time, and it is, it's something that has often been highlighted. But it's not wishful thinking. This is the only way to think about war. We must be focusing on the delivery of justice. I mean, if you look at cases from around the world, whether it's Hissène Habré in Chad, whether it's other leaders, it may take times. It may take a lot of times to bring them to court. But I think ultimately it does happen. It does happen. Justice requires our focused energy, the commitment. We need to have stamina. We need to just keep biting until we get what we want. So it's not wishful thinking. To me, this is the only way to think about what we want for the people of Ukraine and beyond the people of Ukraine. Yeah.
So yes, I mean, I concur. We have no evidence at this stage that specific orders have been given. However, what we do see is that it's kind of the Russian official propaganda, which consists of denying that attacks are being carried out, of accusing the victims of being actors and sort of staging attacks. So clearly, every indication is that at the level of the Russian states these very serious allegation and prima facie evidence of war crimes not being taken seriously. So, yeah, it's not, these are not isolated incidents. Are we investigating violations by Ukrainian forces or any other actors? Of course we do, as we do in every other context. We've, for example, been aware of videos that have surfaced of Ukrainian forces ill-treated and killing prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war. These are, we were able to geolocate and to verify that those videos are indeed genuine, so these also constitute war crimes. As I mentioned earlier, when we investigate attacks by Russian forces, we also spare no effort to understanding the context and the circumstances in which those attacks have taken place. The level of criminal responsibility between a deliberate attack on civilians and a disproportionate or indiscriminate attacks in civilians, where, you know, both are war crimes, but there is, you know, there are important implications, and it's important to make the difference, and that's why we looked at the context, and in the case where we've received information that Ukrainian forces, volunteers, members of the armed forces, that remains to be clarified, were using buildings where civilians were sheltering to stage attacks on the incoming Russian forces, therefore endangering the lives of Ukrainian civilians. That too is in breach of international humanitarian law. So yes, we absolutely do investigate whatever allegation. One point that is important to note is that we do not have access to the territories controlled by Russia, and therefore we are not in a position to investigate and establish whether the attacks that are being launched from here, also using indiscriminate weapons, from civilian areas, but you know where they land, whether they also harm civilians. The reason why we're not able to go there is not our choice, is because the Russian authorities do not allow us access to those areas. The question about weapons, whether we've been able to establish whether the same weapons used by the same units here and you know in Syria and in Libya, we do not have that evidence at the moment, but that's certainly very much part of the reason why we pay so much attention to you know whatever evidence we can find about weapons and munitions being used in different theaters.
Thank you very much. Yeah, from the report and also from the victim themselves, I think we can find the same story. What happened in Syria and here in Ukraine. By example, also we are talking about the same force. Wagner group, by example, we can find them fighting here in Ukraine and also in Syria. There is a lot of report speaking about soldiers. There is proof that they're fighting in Syria before they came here. But it's not only about the person. When we are talking about torture, shooting people just and shooting civilians just to push them to leave their towns and village, to create this refugee problem in Europe. I can also, similar, we see this happen in Syria before also. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I will take the last the next set of questions. Is there a hand there? The gentleman over there, the lady over there, and the gentleman in the back. And we'll take a fourth one from you. Go on. Yeah.
Murray Brewster with CBC News. I'm looking to find out, overall, from anyone on the panel who will say, given how slow international justice moves, what will justice look like for the people who you've been interviewing? My next question is to follow on my colleague. You have been given reports of possible war crimes that have been committed by Ukrainian forces. What's happening to those reports? And are you speaking to Ukrainian authorities?
Andriy Primachenko, Reuters. One of your recent reports states that Ukrainian justice system appears to lack capacity to undertake investigations to international standards. Can you please elaborate on that a little bit more?
Доброго дня, з вашого дозволу.
Thank you very much. I will ask my question in Ukrainian inter-TV channel. Two questions, actually. Meeting Mr. Smirnov from presidential office, AI delegation discussed the possibility of establishing a special tribunal. Do you think that will expedite bringing justice to the perpetrators? And second, if the proceedings are effective and speedy, what victims and Ukraine in general can expect of its outcomes? Ukrinform. Ukraine seems to have been ignoring international law. Do you think that there are any mechanisms that could help actually punish the perpetrators in real life?
Thank you. Panel.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions, colleagues. And I think there is a pattern and a connection in all those questions. So let me try and answer in as comprehensive way as possible. What we know thus far is that there are large-scale violations that are being reported. The number of allegations itself, if it is anything to go by, is enormous. It's in thousands. At the last count, we were told there are about 9,000 plus allegations that are being investigated, 9,000 allegations of crimes being committed that are being investigated. From our research that you just heard about, it is very clear that there is a prima facie evidence for war crimes being committed in the allegations that we have presented to you regarding Bordyanka and Bucha. The question then becomes is how do you ensure credible justice, the question that you ask, and what may the justice look like? I would like to answer that question maybe in two parts. The first is what could be done more in the immediate and the short term, and what we need to do in terms of the longer term. In the immediate, I think the best possible options that we have are through the International Criminal Court and the Ukrainian National Court. There is already cooperation being established between the ICC and the National Court in Ukraine, and I'll come back to the question that was asked in terms of some of the gaps and challenges. And I think given the kind of nature of war crimes that we are talking about, they will be the best suited to do the kind of investigation that is needed to get to the level, the kind of remedies and justice issues that we are trying to determine. This also includes other countries, other countries and national jurisdictions based on universal jurisdiction principle that are able to conduct investigation and prosecute the perpetrators. We already know the investigations which are opened up in Poland, in Lithuania, and in other such countries. However, very much one of the concerns that we have is that of limited capacity. And very soon we will realize that the number of cases that we are talking about, the kind of allegations and the enormity that we are talking about requires some sort of additional mechanism to support the level of investigation that one would need to undertake. And this is what is often classified as a hybrid mechanism to be put in place. Now, there are various options that can be considered in this regard. There is what is being suggested by some as a Nuremberg II possibility, or something which is a group of countries coming together, or something else. It is early days to comment on the merits of some of these proposals. However, one thing that we as Amnesty International would like to underscore is the need for comprehensiveness of approach to international justice and not a selective approach. By that, what I mean is that what we will need to ensure is that there is accountability for all crimes by all perpetrators. And that should be the bedrock based on which we would want to approach. And therefore, if there is such a hybrid mechanism being thought through, we would recommend that such a mechanism should be based through a UN General Assembly led process in joint collaboration with Ukraine. Now, you asked the question in terms of what about the gaps in terms of the Ukrainian national legal system and related issues. There are a few challenges that we have. The first and foremost is the non-ratification of the Rome Statute, which makes it challenging to address the kind of issues, the crimes that we are talking about. The second is the gaps in the national legislation in accordance with the international standards. There are issues such as command responsibility, the definition of the very crime of aggression, which needs to be brought in compliance. And then I have to say the final thing that is a challenge, and that is going to be a challenge, is limited capacity. That kind of numbers that we are talking about, and we expect that there will be more, requires greater support and coordination between different mechanisms to deliver the kind of justice that we are talking about. Because as previous speakers have talked about, the thirst for justice is enormous. The people, just a handful of whom we've been able to talk about, are desperate for some remedies, for some reparations to be provided to them. Thank you.
Just to add one concern that we may have regarding the domestic system and the cooperation with the ICC. As you know, 2 days ago, the Parliament adopted a law of cooperation with the International Criminal Court. That law, unfortunately, precludes the cooperation from including crimes committed by Ukrainian forces. So that's part of the limitation that we are starting to see emerging. It is a reflection of the fact that this is a country at war, and therefore the military's establishment, the defense, do have probably a far bigger influence than they will do in other times. So I think that is reflected in that law that was just adopted in particular, which will create problems for the delivery of justice according to the principle that we have put forward. Again, I think we want, as Amnesty International and my colleagues, we want to insist that, of course, we need some form of military closure and military victory. But most importantly, this war is also about values. It's also about the world that needs to come out of that conflict. And such a world must be predicated on universal principles of justice. Swift politicized prosecution will not carry that outcome. On the contrary, it could just repeat the failure of the past. So that's why we are calling on not only the Ukrainian authorities, but everyone that is supporting them at the moment, not to look for a quick gain, but to really try to build a strong foundation, including for justice for the Ukrainian people. A Nuremberg II tribunal set up by a few countries will not allow to build that global coalition that is needed to transform the conflict into a step towards a better multilateral and international system. that international hybrid mechanism must have the largest basis possible in order to not only deliver the kind of justice that is required, but also the kind of universal principle that is required. And then the last point I want to make regarding the domestic system, and we fully understand that, as it has been highlighted, the scale of the crimes is enormous. So, of course, prioritization will take place. Of course, the prosecutors will have to make choices, as will the ICC. It needs to be explained to the people. There needs to be a management of expectation now, so that there is a better understanding, there is a better empowerment even of the people. The urge may be to focus on crimes where individuals, perpetrators, can be identified. The urge may be to focus on the crime of aggression, because at heart it is far more about the state than it is about the people. We urge the authorities to look and to prosecute as well crimes where perpetrators may not be known, such as indiscriminate attacks, for instance. We urge the authorities to, the crime of aggression must deliver accountability, but so should all the crimes with multiple victims. So it is a complex question that you have asked as to what justice look like. But there are principles, there are limitations that need to be identified now. That's what we are doing, and Amnesty stands here to support in any ways we can. I also should mention the fact that we also recommend that the prosecutors, wherever they are, whoever they are, do reach out to those who have investigated crimes in Syria. Whether it is individual prosecutors through universal jurisdiction in Europe, or whether it is the UN mechanism called the IIIM, the International Impartial Independent Mechanism for Syria. I think it will be important for linkages and learning to be made through that process.
I just wanted to add something on the point of, what justice will look like and sort of, what it looks like now. Having worked on so many other conflicts over more than 2 decades, these things take time, and there is no point in speculating now what justice will look like. But what can be done now is to ensure that evidence is collected and preserved at the standard that it needs to be. And that is being done in certain cases and not in others, from what I've been able to see on the ground over the past 4 weeks. So obviously more attention needs to be paid to that. And secondly, that the survivors and the families of the victims and the victims themselves need to be empowered and need to feel that they are part of the process, and they need to feel that their case is being respected. For example, the families that I've spoken to, whether those victims of extrajudicial execution or those victims of the bombardments, have often complained that they're not being informed, that they're kind of, tracing through, Facebook or whatever social media to find out where the bodies are, and so on and so forth. So, and that is also incumbent on the countries that are supporting Ukrainian militarily, politically, to also support it, to ensure that the capacities are there to deal with the collection and preservation of evidence to the standard that it needs to be. Because I've worked on a number of other conflicts where a lot of promises and a lot of expectations were there, and 10, 20 years later, not the standard of evidence just doesn't deliver the possibility. I would also while there are parallels with Syria or with any other conflict, I would also say that having investigated conflicts throughout the world for over 20 years, the kind of violations that we've seen up to date and that we've been able to investigate and verify here are unfortunately those that we find in most other conflicts. So it's you know, the linkage is there with Syria as it could be, you know, with Libya or with any other conflict in terms of, you know, bombardment, indiscriminate, disproportionate attacks, extrajudicial execution and other unlawful killings, use of indiscriminate weapons. So, you know, just to kind of be clear as to what we're finding by way of evidence and what we're able to verify and confirm.
Thank you, Donatella. And let me just reiterate the international nature of this war. It's about the importance of the value of freedom over tyranny. It's about human dignity, and it's also about humanity. But it's also about bread and butter issues. As we all know here, the global supply chains have been completely impacted, and nowhere is this more felt than downstream in countries in Latin America, in Asia, and especially in Africa. So this is a bread and butter issue which we should all care about. If we allow the kind of thinking that says I'm not Ukrainian or I'm not European or even I'm not African, I will not care, that sort of thinking is very, very dangerous. And we are actually making our world a much more dangerous place to be in. Once we allow that extreme power to take hold, you have no idea who they will come for next. The next, it will be you, or it could be me, and it could be my children, or my grandchildren, or their children afterwards. So we want a world where there is no devastation whatsoever. This is why we're making the calls that we're making today. Unless there is anything else from anyone, I would like to thank all of you for being here today. As I said at the beginning of this press conference, the panelists here are available for further questions and interviews with those that may wish to have extended interviews or individual interviews with the panelists. Oksana has one more thing to say before we leave.
Excuse me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a technical question. So if you want to take interviews from speakers, please stay here. We'll be back in 3 or 5 minutes. Thank you. Вибачте, українською. Якщо
Thank you very much. If you are seeking an interview with one of the panelists, please stay with us. They will be available in 3 to 5 minutes.